Hello and welcome back to the FL Studio Music Production course. This is lesson 9 where we will be going through all of the different effects available inside of FL Studio. This video will act as a reference point rather than a follow along. I'm going to show you all of the effects you can use on your sounds in the quickest way possible. Up until this point we've only used two effects, Reverb and EQ, but there's far more effects available inside of FL Studio, so let's get into these. Let's start by pulling up a piano sound by opening the channel rack, clicking on the plus, and go into FL keys. We're now going to close this and go into the piano roll by right clicking on FL keys and selecting piano roll. Now let's lay down a simple chord progression in the C major scale. Here's how this sounds dry, which means it has no effects on this. Now let's open up the channel rack and assign this to the next free mixer track, which in this case is number 5. Now we can go into the mixer by clicking on this button up here, go to mixer track 5, and then we can add our effects on these empty slots up here. Let's start with Fruity Reverb 2. Reverb adds depth and space to your sound by simulating the reflections that occur in different environments, like rooms, halls, or chambers. It's great for creating a sense of realism or adding atmosphere to your audio. Inside of this plugin, we can adjust the following parameters. Here we have the room size. This adjusts the simulated size of the virtual room or space. Here's the decay time, which sets the duration it takes for the reverb to fade away. Damping allows us to control the amount of high frequency in the reverberated signal over time. Pre-delay sets the delay between the original sound and the onset of the reverb effect. Early reflections level adjusts the level of the initial reflections in the reverb tail. In this case, the dry level would determine the amount of volume from the original piano, and the wet level would determine the amount of reverb you hear. The high cut and the low cut almost act as an EQ for the reverbed audio only, and not the dry signal. And finally, stereo separation controls the stereo width of the reverb effect. This affects whether the reverb sounds thin or wide in your ear. Here's how the piano sounds with reverb. Now let's move on to Fruity Delay 3. Delay creates echoes of your sounds by repeating it after a certain amount of time. Here we can adjust the following parameters. Time sets the delay time between the original sound and the delayed signal. The feedback level determines the number of repetitions or echoes. These filter options, such as the cutoff and low pass and high pass filter options, controls the frequency range of the delayed signal. Here we have delay models of mono, stereo, or ping pong. Ping pong alternates the direction of the stereo delay between the left and right channels. For example, the first echo in your left ear and the second echo in your right ear. Mono mode would keep the delay sounding thin and stereo sounding wide. And this wet level adjusts the level of delayed signal. These are the important parameters that I use inside of Fruity Delay 3. Here's how the piano sounds with a delay applied. Now moving on to Fruity Parametric EQ2. Imagine this as a tool for fine-tuning the tone of your sound. It lets you adjust different frequency ranges so you can boost or cut specific parts of the sound spectrum. For example, you can boost the bass frequencies to make a kick drum punchier, or cut the high frequencies to reduce harshness. By clicking on these buttons up here, we can adjust the band type from the various different options. Here we're going to use a low pass filter for an example. We can adjust these options over here, or we can simply click and drag to move these around. We also have these bandwidth options down here, which controls the width of the frequency band affected by the EQ adjustment. Here's how the piano sounds with a low pass EQ applied. Now moving on to Fruity Compressor. Compression reduces the dynamic range of your sound by lowering the volume or compressing the loudest parts, allowing you to increase the overall volume without causing clipping or distortion. We can adjust these parameters. The threshold sets the level at which the compression begins. The ratio determines the amount of compression applied to signals above the threshold. Attack controls how quickly compression is applied after the signal exceeds the threshold. Release does the opposite and sets the time it takes for compression to stop after the signal falls below the threshold. And then we have the gain, which allows you to boost the volume of the entire process sound to make up for any lost volume as a result of compressing the audio. Here's how this piano sounds with a very significant amount of compression applied. Here we have fruity fast distortion, which adds harmonics and saturation to your sound, giving it a gritty or crunchy texture. We can adjust the following parameters. Here we have the mix level, which simply determines how much distortion is applied to the sound. We have post gain, where we can reduce this if the distortion makes our sound too loud. We have the preamp, which determines the amount of distortion, and the threshold, which determines the frequencies of the distortion. Here's how the piano sounds with distortion applied. Now we have fruity chorus. Chorus is like having multiple versions of your sound singing together. It duplicates your audio signal, slightly changes the pitch of each copy, and then blends them back together. This creates a lush swirling effect that adds depth and dimension to your sound. There's a lot of different parameters you can use here. Here's the important ones. Delay sets the time delay between the original signal and the modulated signal. Depth determines the intensity or amount of modulation applied to the signal. And all of the LFO options modulate the delay time or depth of the chorus effect using a low frequency oscillator. Here's how the piano sounds with a chorus effect. Next we have fruity flanger, which is like creating a wave-like motion in your audio. It takes a copy of your sound, delays it slightly, and then mixes it back with the original. By modulating the delay time, it creates a sweeping, almost jet-like sound that moves up and down in frequency. We can adjust these parameters. Rate sets the speed at which the flanger effect modulates the audio signal. Depth determines the intensity or amount of modulation applied to the signal. Feedback controls the amount of modulated signal fed back into the effect. Phase adjusts the phase relationship between the modulated and dry signal. And the delay determines the delay between the unprocessed and processed signal. Here's how this sounds with the piano. Finally, we have fruity phaser. A phaser splits your audio signal into multiple phase shifted copies, creating peaks and troughs in the frequency spectrum. By modulating the phase relationship between these copies, it creates a sweeping, swirling effect that moves up and down in frequency. We can adjust these parameters. These depth options determines the intensity or amount of modulation applied to the signal. Feedback controls the amount of modulated signal fed back into the effect. Stages sets the number of phase shifting stages in the phaser, affecting the complexity of the effect. Here's how the piano sounds with a phaser effect applied. And that wraps up lesson 9. We now know exactly what all of the important effect plugins in FL Studio do, and now we can use these in our beats to add variation and make our beats sound professional. Inside of all of these effects plugins, we can click the drop down and go to presets, and we can select different presets here. This is super useful as we don't have to understand exactly what each knob does if we wish to use an effect on our sound. Remember, if at any point you wish to revisit this lesson to remind yourself of what these plugins do, then please do.